Donald Trump has made a lot of promises for what he's going to do on day one, like conduct the largest deportation in history, slap a 25% tariff on goods from Mexico and Canada, end the Paris Climate Agreement, and end all foreign wars. It wouldn't be the first time that Trump has made big, bold promises and then blame the courts or Congress for holding it up. Donald Trump likes to say he alone can fix this. But what can he really do alone without congressional approval? What can he do through the power of executive orders? I reached out to conservative legal scholar John Yoo, who has a very expansive view on what the president can do alone through the executive branch. He has, in fact, consulted Donald Trump and George W. Bush on this. And he's pretty forthright about what Trump can actually do, what will likely be held up in the courts, and what is more just agenda setting or creating the impression that he's doing something. What will be the magnitude of the earthquake on day one? Tell me about this evolution from being concerned about the way that Trump was wielding executive power or his thoughts on it to where you are at this point where you think, heck, he can go even further.
Put aside the rhetoric, the political rhetoric for and against Trump. What did he actually do in office? And how did it comport with the way past presidents had used their own executive powers? And I'd like to think that the second Trump term hopefully will be like the first Trump term. There'll be a lot of rhetoric about doing things which the president can't do. But then when he turns out to actually governing, Trump will try to stay within the guide rails that have, even though they're not narrow limits, they're still limits to what presidents can do. Who knows what's going to happen in the second term? But you will see the action, as you're suggesting, will be at the point of executive orders and which ones will come out and how the courts will treat them.
Like if Trump comes into office with an enemies list and he passes it on to his DOJ, is that something that they can even really do? I mean, can they have an official enemies list and investigate those people based on the president's, does he even have to do it by executive order? Because he just tell his team, here's the list, go for it.
So that's a great question. I think that worries everybody, this idea of an enemies list. Past presidents have had enemies lists, right? The phrase enemies list comes from Richard Nixon, right? He had an enemies list. He gave it to him. He
also was, impeached and dishonorably left office. So
yes, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, you could say that, Trump is testing the limits that we've had on the presidency since Watergate, right? Take the enemies list idea. The president is actually in charge of enforcing the law. So the head prosecutor under our Constitution is the president. The attorney general, every single prosecutor in the Justice Department under the Constitution is just the president's assistant in helping him or her enforce the law. So Trump could say to the attorney general, I want you to look into this person. I want you to investigate that person. Nothing stops any president from doing that. The problem for Trump or any president is the courts can always stop you. Right? The courts have you have to go to a grand jury to get search warrant. You have to go to a judge to get search warrants. You have to go to a court to get an indictment. So yes, the president can have the attorney general look into people, but for it to become really serious, you have to actually go to a court. You have to go to a grand jury and explain why you have probable cause.
What if he goes to a favorable court? If he goes to one of his favorable courts, right? The Supreme Court's obviously in his favor. I know they don't go to the Supreme Court, but a lower federal court with a judge that he appointed.
Yeah, ultimately, you're right. You could find a judge who likes, at least on TV, there are these judges that give out all search warrants. They don't even read them, right? They'll just be so friendly to the government and prosecutors. You can imagine that happening. But you still, you can still, cause people a lot of emotional turmoil, financial pain by investigating them at all.
Psychological warfare, too.
Lawfare, right? What the Biden administration has been doing to the Trump people. Ultimately, in our system, and this is one of the great protections of our Constitution, you cannot take someone's liberty away without the approval of a jury. And so, yes, you can cause people a lot of turmoil. But you're right. You could say the whole thing is biased against individuals, biased against Democrats now that Republicans are in charge. I like to think our system doesn't have that kind of bias. We haven't really seen it before in our history where.
But you just accused the Democrats of going after Republicans, in this administration.
Yeah. And I think our system held, actually. I thought that the Biden special counsel orders, I think, were weak.
He was investigated himself, though. I mean, Biden was investigated during his own administration. I don't know. I was particularly like offended when Biden blamed his own attorney general for his son's, prosecution.
He's responsible. Yeah. Under the Constitution, he's responsible for it.
And Biden himself faced a special counsel investigation, just like Trump did. So I don't know. I take exception to that. Maybe in the lower court, somebody could order, like in New York, right? Like where Trump was investigated on a business like compliance issue, which about the porn star hush money. I mean, people would argue that was a weaker case, but at the highest level,
Kara, that's a little different because that's the states. And so what happened in Georgia, Fannie Willis, just yesterday, the New York City prosecution, even there, I think these protections like juries, like fair standards, like appeals, I think even there you're seeing them constrain what Biden wanted to do or what Democrats in New York or Georgia wanted to do. It's still right. Trump put on display in a remarkable way all the protections that really are there from prosecution, because I think he did have prosecutors who were going after him for partisan reasons, particularly, as you say, in the states, not as much in the federal government, but definitely in the states. And he's really prevailing. I mean, he's prevailed in Georgia. I think he'll ultimately prevail in New York. And he really did beat back the special counsel, Jack Smith, because of the same protections that would be there for Biden and Democrats now.
But Jack Smith didn't want to investigate after he won the election. He didn't want to investigate a president who's in office. I think that's why I don't particularly think he beat it back. I think that was a decision by Jack Smith. But I do want to go back to this article you wrote in 2017. You said that Trump's firing of Sally Yates, the acting attorney general, for her stated intention of not defending his immigration policy raises concerns. You said even though the constitutional text is silent on the issue, long historical practice and Supreme Court precedent have recognized a presidential power of removal. Mr. Trump was thus on solid footing because attorney generals have a duty to defend laws and executive orders so long as they have a plausible legal grounding. But the White House undermined its valid use of the removal power by accusing Mrs. Yates of being, quote, weak on borders and very weak on illegal immigration. Such irrelevant ad hominem accusations suggest a misconception of the president's authority of removal. So Donald Trump can, name and confirm a number of cabinet nominees, but if they don't do what he wants, he can remove them. But you're saying that that might be considered an overinterpretation of the president's rights, or what do you think about that?
Tara, that's right. I'm trying to draw there, and maybe it wasn't as clear as I should have been. There's a difference between the constitutional power of the president and then the tradition and norms we followed in using those powers. So under the Constitution, the president has the right to remove any cabinet officer, basically anyone down to the assistant secretary level. The Supreme Court actually made this even clearer than when I wrote the article. 2 years ago, they said the president had the right to fire the head of the CFPB. And they've actually been steadily over the last few years broadening the power of the president to fire people beyond what it had been before Trump took office. But what I thought was important to say is that even though presidents have had that power, they've been very careful in using it. They generally have only used it to fire people when there's a conflict over the president's policy and subordinates who didn't want to follow the policy. The most famous one, again, is Watergate that you mentioned when we started out. Richard Nixon fired the special counsel who was investigating him.
Trump wanted to do it. He wanted to fire Mueller.
The thing with Mueller was really interesting because he kept saying he wanted to fire Mueller. He can fire Mueller. He could have gone on TV and said, I'm firing Mueller. But in the end, he didn't fire Mueller because Mueller, I think Mueller's one of the greatest federal prosecutors in my lifetime. I mean, he's the gold standard within the Justice Department. He's the gold standard. And so it actually helped Trump enormously when Mueller said there was no Russian collusion. Presidents may hate it. They don't want to have these officials, but they actually serve a greater purpose for them. They benefit longer in the long run. Mueller's a great example of that.
Can I just go through, we don't have a ton of time, but I want to go through some of the executive orders that Trump has proposed. And I'd like you to let me know if you think they're toothless or if they have any chance of survival. Okay. Ending birthright citizenship.
Immediately going to court. I don't think it's going to succeed. There's a Supreme Court case from the 19th century, from these cases we've been talking about, immigration, where the court has said people born in the United States are citizens. So he's pushing a big rock up a steep hill on that one. And I think he's going to lose.
Wait, so if my mother and father, so my mother was born in another country, she was not American when I was born, and my parents were not married at the time. So I became American by being born there. But would it been possible to argue that I'm not eligible for citizenship?
That is the rule. Actually, this is ironic. This is the rule in Europe. In Europe and much of the world, your citizenship is based on the parent citizenship. But the United States is unusual, I think, because we have always said it's based on where you're born. And this is in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The reason why I think it's a loser for Trump, and the reason why I think the Supreme Court will stick to its opinion, is because this is one of the reasons we fought the Civil War. Because the South and the slave-owning states said blacks could not be citizens, even though they were born in the U.S., because they're not people under the Constitution. And so after the Civil War, we added the 14th Amendment to make clear, if you're born in the country, you are a citizen.
Okay. He wants to give federal immigration officers more leeway to arrest people with no criminal records who are in this country illegally, and to send more troops to the U.S.-Mexican border and possibly start the reconstruction of the border wall.
The first one he can definitely do. The first one
really?
About priority, which you have a limited number of officers, you have a limited number of money. Who are we going to prioritize to be captured and removed from the country? Most everyone says we should remove people who are felons first. But you're right. The Trump administration has been saying we're just going to try to remove everybody, whether you're criminal or not. And I don't think that's the most effective use of limited resources, but he can do it. That's one thing. The president's in charge of law enforcement. Presidents decide how much money and resources we spend on some crimes versus others. But the other parts, the border wall, he can't build the border wall unless Congress has already created a pot of money somewhere for it and given him the power to move it. Courts have generally never interfered with the president's power over the deployment of troops. So if he wants to deploy troops at the border and say that, we're experiencing some kind of threat that involves our sovereignty, he's allowed to do that.
Can he use those same troops, though, within the country to round up non-citizens?
No, he can't. There's actually a law about that. That's why I was like, this all has to do internally. There's a law that prohibits the military from enforcing the law. That has to be the Justice Department. This is a very complicated question because presidents have done this with drug cartels, for example, or organized crime. The military can back up law enforcement. Like the Coast Guard's allowed to take law enforcement to a ship, but only law enforcement can do the arrests. Only law enforcement can detain people and remove them.
Paris Climate Agreement, he wants to obviously pull out of it. Can he do this? I guess this is another foreign treaty. He arguably could get out of it.
Actually, Obama and Biden made that easier because they're not even treaties. They've never been submitted to the Senate for ratification. So they're just promises by the United States. So yes, Trump can terminate that on day one. But what President Trump's been talking about undoing, he's been talking about pulling out of NAFTA. Not NAFTA, NATO, maybe the most important treaty we have.
Can he do that without Congress?
This is a really important question. The Supreme Court has never ruled, but the lower courts have said that presidents can break treaties. But it's never been done with a really important treaty like NATO. And in fact, Congress has tried to stop them. I think Congress has tried to put appropriation riders on defense bills saying you can't pull out of NATO. So that would spark an enormous constitutional battle. That will cause a constitutional earthquake.
Can he impose tariffs on Mexico, the 25% tariff on all products coming into the U.S.? Is that possible to do on day one?
Yes, it is possible because Congress has actually given the president the power to impose retaliatory tariffs on other countries in response to unfair trade practices.
Pardons. This is one of the broadest presidential powers, right? Can he, on day one, pardon everyone who took part in the January 6th insurrection?
Unfortunately, yes. So the pardon power only has two exceptions. You can only pardon people for federal crimes, and you can't pardon people for impeachment. So any other federal crime that does involve an impeachment, Trump can pardon. So he can pardon everybody. And this is interesting, raised by the Biden pardons. He can even pardon people who haven't been convicted yet. Right? So he could not just pardon everyone currently sentenced and in jail for January 6th. He can pardon anyone being investigated right now for January 6th. He can pardon people who haven't even been investigated yet for involvement with January 6th.
Here's one last one, because I feel like people love parks. He says he would be willing to shrink some of the national monuments to allow more drilling and mining.
This is actually an interesting one. The Supreme Court has not decided yet, but presidents have the power. Actually, Teddy Roosevelt, I think, was the first president to do it. Presidents seized the power to make national parks before Congress ever allowed them. Then Congress passed a law called the Antiquities Act, which said that presidents can declare these national monuments. But what the statute doesn't talk about is, can a president make them smaller? And so some people like me say, if he can make them bigger, he can make them smaller. There are other people who say it's a one-way ratchet. You make a national monument, a later president can't take it away. So that would have to go to the Supreme Court, too.
What's your take? Do you think day one, everyday people are going to feel the impact of the Trump presidency on day one?
Yes. And I think the area they're going to see it is tariffs, because then prices are going to go up, and immigration, because I think you are going to see an effort to remove illegal aliens, many of whom are part of our communities. Right? And so I think that's going to be very disruptive to a lot of our, the towns where we live.
And you think it's going to be like a mass deportation where like people are just being rounded up and like there are officers on the streets and I know you said they can't be troops, but like ICE officers, and it just like immediately felt.
Yeah, no, not like that. And you know why? Because the biggest limit on the president's power here is that Congress doesn't pay for that many officers and gives that much money. So it goes to something you briefly alluded to. The real success for Trump in these areas is going to be whether states cooperate with him or not. Because you know who does have a lot of police officers and personnel? The states, right? The states run. So if, for example, Texas says, we're going to help Trump, we're going to send out, Texas police officers, then you could see that kind of massive deportation. But without the states, Congress hasn't given Trump enough money yet to carry out these plans, these dreams he has.
Wow. All right. Thanks, John. This was really fascinating. Would love to have you back on the show. And I guess we will all wait for about less than 4 weeks from now to see what happens. Of course, it's always impossible to predict what Donald Trump will do next. But if you want more inside reporting, subscribe below.